I'm going to go to Mr. Jafar. The big question is natural gas for the Middle East. I think everyone has oil. The UAE is trying to increase their natural gas production. Saudi is really trying. Iran, Iraq. Where do you think the potential growth, and what's your outlook for production here in the region?
So, I mean, it's clearly a very important question, and it can't be disconnected from what's going on in the rest of the world, and in particular, what we just heard about, the phenomenal shale revolution in the U.S. I mean, I remember working for one of the majors back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the assumption in the industry was wherever you could produce gas in the world, you could send it to the U.S. It was a sink. And nobody imagined that, here in Abu Dhabi, I'd have colleagues on the stage who are competing with producers here in the region and exporting LNG even to this part of the world. Preparing for this panel yesterday, I thought I'm going to be on the panel with some, knowledgeable CEOs. I better do my homework, so I started channel surfing news channels, and two things hit me. One, which everybody's talked about, oil hit $70. Another, which I haven't heard, at least in the plenary session, which really shocked me, and I do want to highlight it as a trend to watch out for, was the city of New York and Bill de Blasio not only disinvesting the New York pension fund from oil and gas, but suing the big five oil majors for the damage caused by the hurricane to New York City. Let's put that in perspective. The oil and gas sector is now being targeted to be blamed for climate change like the cigarette companies were for cancer. And it's some of the same army of lawyers and lobbyists and all the rest of it. And it started a few years ago. People like Dan Yergin were warning us that university campuses and endowments are getting out of this sector. And that's now happening. And I've been warning my colleagues in the sector, they're not doing enough to get the message across about the role, the important role, fundamental role of this industry in tackling climate change. And we do need to, as Bill Clinton says, look beyond the headlines and actually look at the trend lines. I believe in climate change, absolutely. I'm really concerned about it. But we're not going to get there with slogans and politics.
Sure.
We have to actually look at what works and what doesn't work. And to work, it has to be sustainable economically and environmentally. I mean, we heard from the German State Secretary all about electrification. Germany's carbon emissions have risen for the last 3 years. And he's talking about electrification. Almost half their electricity comes from coal. So what's the point of an electric car if half of them are coal-fired cars? The United States, on the other hand, because of the shale gas revolution we've just heard, has the lowest emissions since the early 90s, the lowest per capita since the mid-60s, and in terms of emissions per point of GDP, the lowest ever. And in UK, similar. Because of gas replacing coal, the UK's emissions are like the lowest since Victorian times. And yet, the man on the street, because of this kind of anti-fossil fuel agenda, groups them all in one bucket. The oil and gas and coal are somehow all the same, which is nonsense. And the fact that, it's the cheapest ever. Again, we heard from the UAE minister, you need to look at availability, and you need to look that you have to back it up. So the UAE's energy policy, and most governments don't have forward-looking energy policies. We heard last year at this meeting, he announced the UAE one, looks at equal natural gas and renewables, because they're actually very complementary. The other thing is looking at the use of power. We're talking about oil. Oil demand is not driven by electricity. I mean, we're mixing two different things. The oil demand, as we heard from Fatih Birol again here last year, is being driven by freight, trucking, air transportation, shipping, and the fastest growing sector is petrochemicals. The smartphones you're looking at, the screens you're looking at behind me, so many products that people just take for granted are products of this sector. And people are not understanding that. And it's concerning because we're not actually going to be sustainably and properly tackling climate change. I mean, everybody seems to think that somehow Europe is really good and the US is really bad. Maybe in terms of what's said by the politicians, but if you look at actual emissions, it's the other way around in many cases. So for us, coming back to the Middle East, I think we need to learn from what's happened in these major economies. Having a forward-looking energy strategy like the UAE has laid out is key. We have half the world's oil and gas, and yet a third of oil exports, a sixth of gas exports, so we're punching way below our weight. And we have a lot to be done to be able to achieve our potential, and that is better investment models, including a much bigger role for the private sector. And we heard Dr. Sultan talking about being more creative in the type of partners. That's in tackling energy subsidies to achieve the real prices, which the UAE minister mentioned, because without those you won't be able to justify the investment. And as Fatih Birol said, trying as much as we can to have the happy divorce between the energy, which is so key, I mean it's the lifeblood of the economies, and the politics, because our region clearly suffers from a lot of conflict and geopolitics at the moment. But that changes from day to day. When you're talking about energy investments, you're talking about 25, 30 years. And so you need to be able to make those and not have them affected, or at least minimize the negative impacts of the geopolitical instability.
You mentioned that we need to create better incentives and framework for the private sector to play a bigger role in the energy market. Where do you see the most opportunities in, is it in Saudi Arabia, is it in the UAE, is it in Iraq? Where, you as a Crescent Petroleum, where are you looking at the moment?
So, in our region, and we can't ignore the history, our region went through colonialism and in the collective consciousness of our people, abuse of our natural resources by Western powers. So we came to the 50s, 60s, 70s with nationalization and countries retaking control over their sovereign natural resources. And the focus became national oil companies and mainly focusing on oil. So there was underinvestment in gas, there was underinvestment in exploration, and there was underinvestment in oil products and refinery. So we actually have to import a lot. So I think the recognition now, with the strain on government budgets, is the need for cost efficiencies. And Dr. Sultan is leading huge transformation of ADNOC here in the UAE, recognizing that if you can reduce your costs and be more efficient, that could be an easier win than increasing production given OPEC quotas and so on. Saudi Arabia privatizing, or let's say not privatizing in terms of private sector control, but listing and an IPO of Aramco. The driver, actually, if you listen to the Crown Prince's objectives, was not about raising capital. It was primarily about achieving efficiencies for the national oil companies. So that agenda is going on with the national oil companies, including tackling the subsidies. But there's also a recognition that you cannot just rely on state budgets for all the necessary investments, particularly when you're looking at the entire value chain of energy, including the downstream and supportive infrastructure and exploration and natural gas. But to be able to open up more for investment by the private sector, both regional such as ourselves and international, you need to start looking at the fiscal regimes. It's not just in terms of making it more attractive, less attractive, but the structures of the contracts to be able to really attract the investment, particularly when they have other options like the US or Africa or Latin America For us, we're from the region. We're in our 5th decade. We're focused on this region. The UAE has been our headquarters and home base and historical production. We're very invested in Iraq now, looking at north and south. Other countries across the region that very interesting to us at the moment. Opportunities in Oman, Sudan, Tunisia as well. So the MENA region is our focus, and there's still huge untapped potential. So I think the concern is the second point that you mentioned, that there's still a real concern. There's been so much underinvestment in the last few years in terms of total capex, in terms of FIDs, that this rise up to 70, yes, it may come down by the summer, but in the next couple of years we could see a dangerous spike upwards if that isn't restored. And my reason for highlighting this kind of anti-oil and gas agenda and misconception out there is if the sources of capital start drying up for political reasons, then we have a real problem, not just in terms of economic sustainability, but in terms of properly achieving carbon emissions and the climate change agenda. And actually the biggest event of 2017 that I see was both China and India. I mean, I totally agree. Asia and the Middle East are the growth, in particular for natural gas. Both China and India at the highest levels taking a policy decision to very rapidly increase the natural gas share. I mean, China's growth of LNG imports has just been staggering. And again, for both of them, it wasn't because of a global climate change agenda. It was because of local pollution in the big cities. I mean, we saw what happened in India this year. Shocking. It's been happening in Chinese big cities for a long time. That's where the buy-in happens locally in these economies, is on local pollution and quality of air. So in the interest of time, I'll just give a plug for the Iraq session tomorrow afternoon downstairs around 2 o'clock. And the Iraqi oil minister will hopefully be there, and we'll be also launching a great report that the council has worked on over the last year, the idea of which actually was born at this summit last year. Just high level, I would say on Iraq that despite all the negative headlines, again, look for the trend lines. Iraq and the U.S. are the sources of growth over the last year. It's a record high production and exports, despite no law, ISIS, internal fights, the Kurdish referendum, corruption, infrastructure challenges. So despite all that, we've seen that phenomenal growth. And I think now that hopefully things have stabilized on the security side, both with ISIS and the Kurdistan question, the future is even more promising. It's vastly underexplored. I would not be surprised if it had the highest oil reserves in the world once the exploration is done. We're totally just getting started, really. There are major challenges, but I think it's going to be a growing and important player.
I want to turn first to Majid to talk a little bit about one of your comments that you made yesterday on the CEO panel. You were asked about Iraq, and in responding noted both that Iraq has immense potential and is vastly underexplored. So I'm wondering if you might be able to give some of your insights from a private sector perspective on why Iraq still remains underexplored despite this immense potential that you often have referenced.
So we're headquartered here in the UAE, but we've been proud to have maintained a presence consistently in Iraq, in Baghdad, since the 80s. We're now, as a group, we've invested close to $2.5 billion in the country in the last decade, about half of that in the oil and gas sector, and also through affiliates in the power sector and port management, logistics. So across the energy and logistics infrastructure from the north, the Kurdistan region, center of the country, and in the south down to Qasr port. We've also pre-qualified with the Ministry of Oil in Baghdad, as has our affiliate Dana Gas, and we're going to be bidding on the new fields that have been offered this year by the Ministry of Oil as a priority for development. So Iraq, as everybody knows, has had a turbulent history. There was the a kind of peak in terms of post-nationalization and peak production at the time, although it's now been exceeded, which is amazing, as you heard from His Excellency, despite all the challenges. But at the time in the 70s, and then of course there was the Iraq-Iran war, which was a drain on revenues, but also an impediment to investment. But then after that, the 90s with sanctions, and then the wars with the international communities. So in many ways, the Iraqi oil industry became isolated from the international industry in terms of technology, investment, know-how, and exploration. I mean, there's only been a few thousand wells drilled in Iraq's history, and compared to maybe 10 times as many in Saudi Arabia, or over 1 million just in the state of Texas as a comparison. So it's very vastly underexplored. There are dozens of fields which by any international measure would be called giant. In Iraq they call them medium-sized or even smaller, because it's all relative. When there are so many fields, mashallah, over 1 billion barrels in the country. And there's still a lot of exploration. Most of the fields that have been discovered historically are in the populated areas, which you'd expect, from Kirkuk down to Basra. So there are huge parts of the country which are vastly underexplored. For example, we in Crescent did a study. We estimated over 300 structures in the Western Desert, which have potential, which have never even been drilled. So there's a lot of exploration to be done, in addition to the development of the known fields, as well as the investments in gas and the associated infrastructure. So the jump to 140 billion barrels a day, I don't think will be the last jump in Iraq's reserves for sure. And it's really been, in terms of growth, it's been Iraq and the U.S. that have added significant capacity in recent years. And I think that will only continue. I mean, His Excellency mentioned the achievements, but I think maybe he underestimated. When you think the war with ISIS, the lack of the legislation still, issues between the central government and the regional government in Kurdistan, the infrastructure needs, the huge drain on the budget from the conflicts and salaries and everything else. So with all that as a backdrop, to achieve record production and exports this year is really quite an achievement, and the only way is up going forward. Sure. So we've invested over $1 billion in the projects in the north of the country, in the Kurdistan region, and these two gas fields were thought to be 1-2 TCF. We've proven up reserves of over 15 TCF, potential resources of 80 trillion cubic feet plus billion barrels, several billion barrels of oil potentially, and that was just in 2 fields. There are multiple non-associated gas fields across the country, in the west, in the south, in the center of the country, which have yet to be developed, in addition to the huge amounts of associated gas, which the Minister referred to, which are being flared. And our primary focus, as regional companies, we look at addressing the local needs first. And that was really we were in our 10th year of production now. We're producing about 300 million cubic feet a day, plus 1,000 tons a day LPG and 14,000 barrels a day condensate. We had a long-standing dispute with the regional government, which was successfully resolved earlier this year. And we're now looking to increase the production by about 20% by later this year, and potentially adding another 500 million cubic feet a day within 2 years. So significant growth. And the primary or priority focus is the local needs, not only in the Kurdistan region, but potentially elsewhere in Iraq, whether gas or electricity. But really, Iraq has enough gas to meet local needs, and that must be the first priority, electricity and industry, and achieve exports. I mean, there's been publicly intention to export to Kuwait soon, so north and south by pipeline, and maybe LNG. I know that was one of the interests of Shell, was to do LNG exports from the south as well. And Iraq is strategically located that it can be doing all of these things. But of course, the first priority must be the local needs. It's, and that's natural, and it's also the highest and best use for the host government to replace liquid fuels. And we heard a lot yesterday how natural gas is a key fuel of this energy transformation that we've been hearing about in terms of reducing the carbon emissions as well as huge economic value add. And, we heard from His Excellency, the UAE Minister, that for the 2050 vision for the UAE energy policy, it's almost an equal weighting between natural gas and renewables because they're very complementary. And you need the natural gas to back up renewables because of availability factors.
Sure, and if I could just follow up on that, I was wondering, given the focus on the domestic market first and the role that natural gas could play in improving things like electric service provision or the creation of value-added industries and things like this, if you see any steps that can be taken to further develop and really enhance the creation of a domestic natural gas market in Iraq.
So I think creating the right investment models is very important to enable the private sector to invest in the different pieces of infrastructure. You need a lot more infrastructure with gas, of course. You need processing and pipelines, and so that's important. What kind of investment models? And of course, the regulatory framework. I mean, we heard about the fiscal regimes for the upstream, and the ministry now giving more flexibility, looking at different models which better align the investor with the host government. So it's not even about more attractive terms or less attractive terms. It's how to make sure that the investor is putting their risk capital to work for themselves and the government, and they're getting the right upside based on energy pricing, but increases production as quickly as possible while saving money for the government. And that's even more important with gas because the investments are bigger, the payback takes longer, and you need to have a different mindset almost. And there's been talk by some politicians in Iraq that the ministry should be named as oil and gas, and more weighting be given to that aspect. And clearly part of that, as we discussed yesterday, is tackling subsidy and end-user pricing. Because of the electricity, which is a big part of the market, is not at the real pricing that, as His Excellency, the UAE Minister said, if you actually achieve real pricing, then you enable the investment in the upstream and in the midstream that's required. The whole value chain then becomes sustainable. So I think, this time last year, the two risks for Iraq were, of course, ISIS and the, Kurdistan independence moves, and both seem to be, part of history now, and then there's somehow political stability, although there's still issues to address on both. So that's very positive. And I think very importantly is improving relations, very strong relations now with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Kuwait. This meeting next month that Kuwait is hosting with the World Bank is extremely important to raise financial support for rebuilding the areas that were liberated from ISIS, because the reconstruction needs are huge. And that's important that the world gets behind that. And also being very much back in the OPEC fold and playing an important role with world energy markets, I think is all very positive. And the recognition from the ministry of a need to adapt in terms of the investment models, I think is also positive. That there's been learning from what's worked, what hasn't worked in recent years. So all of those, I think, give cause to optimism. But the challenges are still many, and you can't be complacent about them, as the minister said. So my we accept the delegation. So, when it comes to oil and gas, I'm not going to comment on the politics around independence or whatever, but I think all sides accept and abide by the Constitution. The challenge is its interpretation, but also its application. When it comes to oil and gas, there are certain things which are sovereign authorities for the federal government, and then there are others which are for the governor. It's like here in the UAE, it's very clear what's federal and what's at the emirate level. But then oil and gas had this kind of in-between. It wasn't exclusively federal, and there were rights at the regional level and at the governorate level. And it talked about joint administration and revenue. So the principle of revenue sharing is there, and then joint administration. So none of that was put in place, unfortunately. So there have been shortcomings really on both sides, I think, from the federal government side and from the regional government side. But I think now, looking forward, there's a recognition that the principles of the Constitution need to prevail. And it's actually getting into the details now, what we're reading about the public statements. Prime Minister Abadi has accepted to pay the salaries. But the question is, how many salaries? The Kurdistan regional government says we have 1.2 million state workers, which is way more proportionally than southern Iraq has, which is already very high. And the federal government is saying at least 500,000 of those aren't real. There are people collecting more than one salary, or even ghost employees, and nobody really knows, and it's not quick and easy to determine that. Then there are issues about managing the borders. I think there's recognition from the KRG that the federal government needs to have oversight of borders. It's a sovereign thing. But they're worried about federal army taking complete control. So, airports, borders, I understand there's a delegation going today from the KRG to Baghdad to discuss these issues. So I think there are no major matters of principle, at least from what I see. But of course there's mistrust on both sides, and the devil is in the detail, and there needs to be will on both sides to address these, long-standing topics. And of course there's elections for both coming up this year, which complicates things. I just wanted to say a thank you to Ellen, and the report which is on your seats, which we were proud to support as part of our platinum support for the summit. She wrote it all herself, and it's actually very impressive. So please grab a copy and take a look, and I'd like to thank her for authorship of it and for moderating our panel also.